The morning of February 17th, 1944. Aboard the headquarters of the 4th Fleet at Truk Atoll, Rear Admiral Masami Kobayashi stood before a wall map of the Caroline Islands, his fingers tracing the protective ring of coral that encircled what Japanese propaganda called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Through the windows of his command post, he could see the evidence of Japan's naval might. Dozens of merchant vessels, 5 tankers vital to the Southern Resources Campaign, destroyers, cruisers, and support ships filling the massive lagoon that stretched 40 miles across. The fortifications bristled with anti-aircraft positions. 365 aircraft were dispersed across 5 airfields, and protecting it all, the fundamental assumption that had guided Japanese naval strategy for 4 decades that when the Americans finally came, Japanese battleships with their superior 18.1-inch guns would destroy any force foolish enough to challenge them in these waters. What Kobayashi did not know, could not have known in that pre-dawn darkness, was that 35,000 yards beyond the horizon, Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 58 had already begun launching its aircraft. 550 combat planes were about to demonstrate that the age of the battleship was over, and among the surface forces waiting to intercept any Japanese ships attempting escape, the battleships Iowa and New Jersey carried weapons that would announce a new reality to the Imperial Japanese Navy, not through the decisive gun duel Japanese doctrine demanded, but through something far more devastating: the absolute integration of industrial power, technological superiority, and tactical flexibility that no amount of spiritual fortitude could overcome. The story of Truk begins not with American guns, but with Japanese certainty. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For nearly 40 years, since Admiral Togo's crushing victory over the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima in 1905, Japanese naval strategy had been built on a single foundational principle: Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. Japan, with fewer resources and smaller industrial capacity than potential adversaries, would compensate through superior quality. Every Japanese warship would be more powerful than its counterpart. Every Japanese sailor would be more skilled. And when the decisive moment came when the American fleet steamed across the Pacific to reclaim territory, Japan's concentrated battle line would annihilate them in a single, overwhelming engagement far from American supply lines. This was not mere theory. Tsushima had proven it. 27 capital ships of the Russian 2nd and 3rd Pacific Squadrons had sailed halfway around the world, only to be destroyed in the Tsushima Strait. The Japanese had lost 3 torpedo boats. The Russians had lost 21 ships and 4,800 men. It was the most decisive naval victory since Trafalgar, and it became scripture for Japanese naval planners. The doctrine shaped everything. It determined the design of Japanese battleships, which carried the largest guns ever mounted on warships, the Yamato-class monsters, with their 46-centimetre, 18.1-inch main batteries that could hurl 3,200-pound shells 26 miles. It influenced training regimens that transformed Japanese naval gunners into some of the most accurate in the world, and it fostered an institutional confidence bordering on arrogance. Japanese planners at the Naval War College had war-gamed the coming conflict hundreds of times. The scenario was always the same. American forces would advance across the Central Pacific to retake the Philippines. Japanese submarines and land-based aircraft would whittle down the American fleet during its approach. Then, in the decisive battle area near the Philippines, or perhaps the Marianas, the combined fleet would engage with overwhelming force. American quantity would be defeated by Japanese quality. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had only reinforced these beliefs. When the treaty limited Japan to a 5-to-3 ratio against the United States in capital ship tonnage, Japanese negotiators had argued passionately for 7-to-10, not out of diplomatic posturing, but from genuine strategic calculation. Their war games showed that a 7-to-10 ratio, combined with the advantage of fighting close to Japanese bases, would guarantee victory in the decisive battle. The Americans had refused. They insisted on 5-3, and in doing so, they had inadvertently convinced an entire generation of Japanese naval officers that America did not understand modern naval warfare. By early 1944, Japanese confidence remained largely intact, despite the setbacks at Midway and in the Solomon Islands. Yes, they had lost carrier aircraft. Yes, the combined fleet had withdrawn from some forward positions. But the core of Japanese naval power, the battleship force built around Yamato and Musashi, the most powerful warships ever constructed, remained largely untouched. The decisive battle had not yet occurred, and at Truk, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, Japanese forces maintained a forward bastion that seemed impregnable. The base itself was testament to the Japanese strategic vision. Truk Lagoon, roughly circular and 40 miles in diameter, was surrounded by a barrier reef that created a natural fortress. 5 narrow passes allowed entry, each easily defended. Inside the lagoon, the deep water could accommodate the entire combined fleet. By 1942, Japanese construction battalions had built 5 airfields and a seaplane base. Fuel storage tanks held 17,000 tons of oil. Repair facilities could service everything from submarines to battleships. And the garrison, by February 1944, numbered over 27,000 men. More importantly, Truk was a symbol. American newspapers had called it the Japanese Pearl Harbor, a nickname that pleased Japanese propagandists who saw it as acknowledgement of Japanese strategic parity. The base anchored Japan's defense perimeter. From Truk, Japanese forces could threaten any American advance through the Central Pacific. Air power based at Truk could strike targets from the Marshalls to New Guinea. And the fundamental assumption was that if the Americans tried to assault Truk directly, they would face the kind of attritional battle that would make them reconsider their entire Pacific strategy. But in early February 1944, something was changing. Japanese scout planes had detected American patrol bombers photographing Truk on February 4th. Admiral Minachi, Koga, commander of the combined fleet, had ordered the major warships withdrawn to Palau. On February 10th, the carrier force departed. By February 15th, most of the heavy units were gone. Only the auxiliaries, transports, and rear echelon forces remained, along with the 365 aircraft that Japanese commanders believed could repel any attack. What remained at Truk was a test case. If American forces attacked now, they would face not the combined fleet's battleships, but land-based air power fighting from prepared positions with the advantage of interior lines. Japanese doctrine held that well-prepared land-based aviation, supported by anti-aircraft defenses, could devastate any naval force that came within range. It was defensive doctrine, true, but it was doctrine rooted in respect for air power's lethality. If the Americans were foolish enough to attack Truk with carriers, Japanese commanders believed, they would learn an expensive lesson. They were right about the expense. They were catastrophically wrong about who would pay it. At 03:30 on the morning of February 17th, 72 Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters began their launches from the 5 American carriers positioned 90 miles north of Truk. The Japanese radar operators detected them almost immediately. What they did not detect, could not detect with their inferior equipment, was the full scope of what was coming. Behind the fighter sweep, 480 more aircraft were preparing to launch, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and additional fighters that would maintain continuous pressure on Truk for 2 full days. Japanese air defense commanders scrambled their fighters. For perhaps 30 minutes, they believed they were facing a large but manageable raid. Then the American Hellcats arrived over the airfields. What happened next was not a battle. It was an execution. The Hellcats dove out of the early morning sun at aircraft lined up on Truk's 5 airfields. Japanese fighters attempting to take off were caught in their takeoff rolls, vulnerable and slow. Those that managed to get airborne found themselves facing American pilots with 600 hours of training flying aircraft specifically designed to kill Zeros. The Hellcat was faster, more heavily armored, more powerfully armed, and crucially supported by radar-directed fighter control that allowed American commanders to vector their pilots toward threats with a precision Japanese defenders could not match. By 0600 hours, Japanese air power at Truk had effectively ceased to exist. 127 aircraft were destroyed on the ground in the first hour. Another 63 shot down attempting to intercept. The American fighter sweep had cost 17 Hellcats, but it had accomplished its primary mission: air superiority over what was supposed to be one of the most heavily defended Japanese bases in the Pacific. And now the bombers came. Lieutenant Commander Robert H. Dale, leading the fighter sweep from USS Bunker Hill, radioed back to the task force. This is a fighter pilot's dream. There are aircraft everywhere, and practically no opposition. It was the kind of message that sent chills through Japanese commanders listening on their monitoring sets, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. The Americans were not just attacking Truk, they were doing so with such overwhelming force, such complete coordination, that their pilots were finding it easy. This was not supposed to be possible. Japanese doctrine, Japanese training, Japanese spiritual superiority, all of it was supposed to prevent exactly this scenario. Yet here were American pilots, calmly reporting that the Gibraltar of the Pacific was defenseless beneath them. In the harbor, the real slaughter was beginning. American dive bombers and torpedo bombers, freed from the worry of fighter opposition, methodically worked their way through the anchored shipping. The tankers went first: Hoyo Maru, Shinkoku Maru, San Francisco Maru, Fujikawa Maru. Each was vital to Japan's ability to supply its far-flung garrisons. Each represented months of industrial production, and each was destroyed in minutes by pilots who attacked at will, lining up perfect bombing runs on stationary targets. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was intense but ineffective. The American pilots had been trained to attack through flak. Their aircraft could absorb damage that would have destroyed Zeros. And critically, American doctrine emphasized coordinated attacks, multiple aircraft hitting a single target from different angles simultaneously, overwhelming the defenders' ability to concentrate their fire. By mid-morning on February 17th, Truk Lagoon resembled a scene from maritime hell. Burning ships sent columns of black smoke thousands of feet into the air. Secondary explosions as ammunition ships detonated shook the atoll, and American aircraft continued to arrive in waves, each wave directed by fighter control officers aboard the carriers who tracked every target, every defending aircraft, every strike package with a precision that Japanese commanders had never imagined possible. Captain Tamikio Oda, commanding the light cruiser Katori, made a decision that morning that would cost him his life, but would also illuminate the fundamental difference between Japanese and American naval doctrine. Rather than remain in the lagoon to be destroyed at anchor like the merchantman, he would sortie. He would take Katori, the auxiliary cruiser Akagi Maru, the destroyers Maikaze and Nowaki, and the mine-sweeping trawler Shonan Maru No. 15, and he would attempt to break out to the north, making for Yokosuka and safety. It was the decision Kantai Kessen doctrine demanded. When faced with certain destruction, sortie and give battle, make the enemy pay for every ship in blood, go down fighting, as befits a warrior of the Imperial Japanese Navy. What Captain Oda did not know, what he could not have known, was that Admiral Raymond Spruance had anticipated exactly this response, and waiting beyond the northern horizon, specifically positioned to intercept any ships attempting to flee, was Task Group 50.9. The force Spruance personally commanded that morning represented the new American way of war. 2 battleships, USS Iowa and USS New Jersey, the first of America's fast battleship class, capable of 33 knots and mounting 9 16-inch, 50-caliber Mark 7 guns, the most advanced naval rifles ever built. 2 heavy cruisers, USS Minneapolis and USS New Orleans, both survivors of the savage night actions off Guadalcanal, now equipped with improved radar fire control, 4 destroyers, providing anti-submarine screening. And overhead, maintaining continuous combat air patrol, aircraft from the light carrier USS Cowpens. It was combined arms warfare at its most refined. Air power, for reconnaissance and strike capability. Surface vessels with radar-directed fire control that could engage targets beyond visual range. High-speed mobility that could outrun anything they couldn't outfight. And all of it coordinated through radio communications and radar tracking that gave American commanders a real-time picture of the entire battlespace. When Katori's small squadron emerged from the northern pass at 0430 on February 17th, American search planes spotted them within minutes. Spruance received the contact report at 0500. By 0600, Task Group 50.9 was closing at high speed, tracking Katori with radar sets that could see clearly in conditions where Japanese optical rangefinders were nearly useless. Captain Oda knew he was being tracked. Radio intercepts told him American aircraft were shadowing his formation, but he pressed on. Japanese doctrine offered no alternative. Run and hide? Unthinkable for a warship of the Imperial Navy. Surrender? Never considered. The only honourable course was to fight, to inflict what damage he could, and to die in a manner that would bring honour to the fleet and to the Emperor. It was a mindset forged in centuries of samurai tradition. It was also utterly, tragically obsolete. At 1300 hours, American aircraft from cowpens attacked Katori's formation. The dive bombers and torpedo planes concentrated on the larger ships, scoring hits on both Katori and Akagi Maru. Oda's anti-aircraft gunners fought back, but they were firing at aircraft that could absorb multiple hits and keep flying. The Americans were methodical, professional. They were not warriors seeking glory. They were technicians solving problems. Then, at 13:15 hours, the horizon ahead of Katori erupted with the angular shapes of American warships, Iowa and New Jersey, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even at extreme range. The moment Japanese naval strategists had been planning for since Tsushima had arrived. A surface action, warships against warships, guns against guns. Except it wasn't the decisive battle Kantai Kessen had promised. It was target practice. Iowa opened fire at 14,500 yards over 8 miles, using her Mark 7 guns, coupled with Mark 38 fire control radar. The first salvo straddled Katori, 1 shell to port, 1 to starboard. Japanese observers aboard the cruiser watched in horror as massive geysers erupted on either side of their ship. The American gunners had found the range with their first shots. Katori's own main battery, 4 5.5-inch guns, couldn't even reach the American battleship at that range. Captain Oda ordered Katori to launch torpedoes, a desperate, brave, futile gesture. Japanese Type 93 long-lance torpedoes were the finest in the world, capable of ranges up to 24 miles at 48 knots. But they were slow compared to radar-directed 16-inch shells that crossed 8 miles in less than 30 seconds. And American radar operators could track torpedo wakes, allowing Iowa to maneuver clear while maintaining fire. The second salvo from Iowa struck home. A 16-inch shell weighs 1,900 pounds when it leaves the barrel at 2,600 feet per second. When it impacts, the kinetic energy alone is devastating. But these were high-capacity shells, designed to explode on contact rather than penetrate heavy armor. Against Katori's thin plates, they were catastrophic. The first hit struck Katori amidships, penetrating through to the engine spaces. The explosion tore a 20-foot hole in the cruiser's hull and sent chunks of steel plating spinning through the air like playing cards. The second hit destroyed the forward gun turret, killing everyone inside instantly. The third set fire to the superstructure. Katori was dying, but Oda would not strike his colors. Japanese naval tradition did not include surrender. Iowa continued firing. A fourth hit. A fifth. Japanese survivors later described each impact as feeling like the ship had been struck by a bomb rather than a shell. The cruiser began to list to starboard as flooding overwhelmed the damage control parties. Fires raged uncontrolled, and still Iowa fired, each salvo carefully adjusted by radar, each shell arriving with metronomic precision. By 13:43 hours, Katori was dead in the water, listing heavily, and burning from stem to stern. Captain Oda was dead, killed when a shell fragment decapitated him on his bridge. Of the cruiser's crew of 450 men, fewer than half would survive the sinking. Oda would be posthumously promoted to Rear Admiral recognition of his courage in the face of impossible odds. But courage without capability is merely sacrifice. And what died with Katori was not just a light cruiser. It was the illusion that Japanese quality could overcome American quantity. It was the assumption that superior spiritual fortitude could compensate for inferior technology. It was the fundamental premise of Kantai Kessen. While Iowa methodically destroyed Katori, New Jersey, and the heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans hunted down the rest of the Japanese squadron. Destroyer Maikaze lasted until 1343 hours, absorbing tremendous punishment before finally sinking with all hands. The trawler, Shonan Maru No. 15, was destroyed by the destroyer USS Burns. Akagi Maru, heavily damaged by air attack and shell fire, drifted burning until she exploded and sank later that afternoon. Only destroyer Nowaki escaped, and her escape illustrated exactly how outclassed Japanese forces had become. The destroyer fled at maximum speed, nearly 35 knots, zigzagging desperately. Both Iowa and New Jersey gave chase, opening fire at 35,700 yards over 20 miles, a distance that would have been impossible to engage accurately in any previous war. The Americans were firing under radar control, adjusting their salvos based on electronic tracking rather than visual ranging. They straddled Nowaki repeatedly, shells landing so close that survivors reported splinter damage and casualties from near misses. It was the longest-range engagement in battleship history, and it would have been utterly impossible without the radar fire control systems that gave American warships what Japanese vessels lacked: the ability to hit what they couldn't see. Nowaki escaped only because she fled directly into the setting sun, creating a glare that interfered with American visual tracking. Even then, she took damage from near misses. Her survival was not a tactical victory. It was a statistical anomaly. By sunset on February 17th, the first day of Operation Hailstone, the scale of Japanese losses was becoming apparent. Over 150 aircraft were destroyed, 15 warships sunk or critically damaged. 32 merchant vessels were destroyed, representing almost 200,000 tons of shipping, 10% of Japan's total merchant tonnage lost between November 1943 and June 1944, destroyed in a single day. But the devastation was only beginning. The second day of Operation Hailstone began before dawn on February 18th, with Japanese commanders at Truk facing a reality that shattered every assumption of their naval doctrine. American carriers were still on station, American aircraft were still flying, and the systematic destruction of Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific would continue with the same methodical precision that had characterized the previous day's attacks. For Rear Admiral Masami Kobayashi, the night between the attacks had been spent in desperate attempts to restore some semblance of defensive capability. Of the 365 aircraft that had been operational 36 hours earlier, fewer than 70 remained in any condition to fly. The lagoon was choked with burning wrecks and oil slicks. Radio communications revealed that Katori's squadron had been destroyed attempting to escape. And most ominously, there was no word from Combined Fleet Headquarters about relief forces. The reality was stark. Truk would not be reinforced. It would not be avenged. It would simply be destroyed and then bypassed, left to wither as American forces continued their advance. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The second day's strikes concentrated on what remained of value within the lagoon and on shore installations. American dive bombers worked over the airfields methodically, cratering runways and destroying hangars. Torpedo bombers struck the remaining merchant vessels. Fighter bombers demolished fuel storage tanks, repair facilities, and barracks areas. The attacks were not frenzied or vengeful. They were clinical. American pilots were working down target lists, checking off objectives, returning to their carriers, rearming, and launching again. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses fought back with determination that bordered on fanaticism. Gun crews remained at their posts even as bombs fell around them. But determination without adequate technology is merely martyrdom. Japanese anti-aircraft shells used contact fuses. They had to hit their target directly to detonate. American aircraft, by contrast, were being protected by a revolutionary technology that Japanese defenders had never encountered. Proximity fuses. The VT proximity fuse, developed in utmost secrecy by American scientists working under the National Defense Research Committee, represented one of the war's most significant technological breakthroughs. Each shell contained a miniature radar transmitter that detected when the shell passed near an aircraft and detonated automatically. The result was a dramatic increase in lethality, where a contact-fused anti-aircraft shell might require hundreds of rounds to down a single aircraft. Proximity-fused shells could create lethal fragmentation clouds that shredded anything within 70 feet. Post-war analysis would show that proximity fuses increased the kill probability of anti-aircraft fire by 700%, but Japanese gunners at Truk had no proximity fuses. They had determination, they had courage, they had generations of warrior tradition. What they didn't have was the technology to make any of it matter. Throughout February 18th, American carrier aircraft flew 1,250 sorties over Truk, dropping 400 tons of bombs and torpedoes on shipping targets and 94 tons on shore installations. The attacks continued into the night, another innovation that left Japanese defenders reeling. American carriers were conducting radar-guided night bombing attacks, something Japanese air forces had never attempted operationally. American radar operators could track their own aircraft, vector them toward targets invisible in the darkness, and guide them back to their carriers for landing. It was a capability that effectively extended American striking power to 24 hours per day. Late on the evening of February 18th, Japanese torpedo bombers based on Formosa launched a desperate counterattack against Task Force 58. 7 Nakajima B, 5N Kate bombers, flying at wavetop height to avoid radar detection, attempted to penetrate the American screen. They were detected anyway. American radar could track aircraft at sea level under conditions that would have been impossible for optical observers. Combat air patrol fighters were vectored toward the threat. 5 of the 7 Japanese bombers were shot down before they could launch their torpedoes. The 2 that survived long enough to attack scored a single hit. A torpedo struck USS Intrepid on the starboard quarter, damaging steering and killing 11 sailors. It was the only significant damage Task Force 58 would suffer during the entire operation. Intrepid withdrew for repairs and returned to combat in August. The 7 Japanese aircrews died without knowing their attack had changed nothing. The American advance would continue exactly as planned. When the last American aircraft returned to their carriers on the evening of February 18th, the staff officers aboard Task Force 58 began tabulating results. The numbers told a story of annihilation so complete it bordered on the unbelievable. Aircraft destroyed. Between 250 and 275, including land-based and carrier-based Japanese planes. American losses. 25 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents and anti-aircraft fire. The kill ratio was more than 10 to 1. Ships sunk. 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, 1 submarine tender, 2 submarine chasers, 1 auxiliary minesweeper, 3 auxiliary cruisers, 5 tankers, precious tankers that Japan could not replace, and 32 merchant vessels totaling nearly 200,000 tons. American losses: 0 ships sunk, 1 carrier damaged, 1 battleship slightly damaged by a bomb that caused minimal casualties. Supplies destroyed. 75% of all stores at Truk, including the vital fuel reserves. Japanese personnel killed, approximately 4,500. American dead, 40. The strategic impact was even more devastating than the tactical results. Truk, which Japanese propaganda had proclaimed impregnable, had been neutralized in 48 hours without a single American amphibious landing. The lesson was immediately clear to American planners. Strongly fortified Japanese positions did not need to be assaulted. They could be bypassed, isolated, and left to die. This insight would shape the entire remainder of the Pacific campaign. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, would later write that Operation Hailstone accomplished two objectives simultaneously. It eliminated Truk as a viable forward base for the combined fleet, and it secured the flank for the invasion of Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands, which began the very same day that Hailstone commenced. While American carriers were destroying Truk, American Marines were landing on Eniwetok. The Japanese garrison there had hoped for air support from Truk. That support never came because Truk no longer existed as a functioning military base. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, Operation Hailstone forced a moment of terrible clarity. The official after-action reports were models of bureaucratic evasion. Enemy forces were more numerous than anticipated. Defensive preparations were insufficient given the short warning time. Replacement aircraft would need to be dispatched to rebuild the air garrison. But the private assessments, the ones that circulated among senior officers who understood what had really happened, were far more brutally honest. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor and was now stationed at Saipan, reviewed intelligence reports on the American attack with growing dismay. His notes, preserved by post-war researchers, reveal his understanding. The Americans have achieved complete integration of air power, surface forces, and technology in a way we have not approached. Their radar allows them to fight at night and in bad weather. Their industrial capacity allows them to replace losses faster than we can inflict them. Most critically, their doctrine has evolved while ours has remained frozen. We are fighting the war we prepared for in 1935. They are fighting the war that exists in 1944. The technological disparities were stark and getting worse. American radar technology had advanced dramatically since Pearl Harbor. The SK air search radar aboard American carriers could detect aircraft at 150 miles. Japanese air search radars struggled to track targets beyond 50 miles. American fire control radar allowed battleships like Iowa to engage targets accurately at ranges where Japanese optical rangefinders were nearly useless. American fighter direction officers, sitting in darkened rooms aboard carriers and watching radar displays, could coordinate hundreds of aircraft simultaneously, with a precision that Japanese commanders, directing by visual signals and radio voice commands, could never match. Then there was the question of pilot quality, a disparity that would only worsen as the war continued. The average American fighter pilot arriving at a fleet carrier in early 1944 had completed approximately 600 hours of flight training. Primary training, 350 hours. Advanced training, 200 hours. Squadron training, another 100 hours. By the time they entered combat, American pilots could execute complex maneuvers, instinctively, had fired their guns extensively, and had practiced carrier landings until they could do them in darkness or bad weather. Japanese pilot training in early 1944 had been drastically curtailed by fuel shortages and pilot losses. New pilots arriving at combat squadrons averaged fewer than 100 hours total flight time. Many had never fired their guns at a moving target. Some had never practiced carrier landings. They were being sent into combat against American pilots who were not only more experienced but who were flying objectively superior aircraft. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat had been designed specifically to defeat the Zero. It was heavier, carrying 212 pounds of armor plate protecting the pilot and fuel tanks. It was faster, with a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine generating 2,000 horsepower compared to the Zero's 1,130. It carried 650 caliber machine guns that could shred a Zero with a few hits, and it could dive faster than a Zero could turn. American pilots had been trained in tactics that exploited these advantages. Dive from altitude, attack with speed, extend away before the Zero could bring its superior turning radius to bear. It was dissimilar combat tactics, refined and institutionalized. Japanese pilots flying Zeros were still being trained to dogfight, to rely on maneuverability and what their instructors called fighting spirit. Against pilots of equal skill in equal aircraft, this worked. Against American pilots in Hellcats who refused to dogfight and simply executed high-speed slashing attacks, it was suicide. The industrial disparity was perhaps the most crushing of all. In 1944, American factories would produce 96,000 aircraft. Japanese factories would produce 28,000. American shipyards would complete multiple carriers per month. Japanese yards would struggle to repair the carriers they already had. Every American pilot who was shot down had 3 replacements in training. Every American aircraft that was destroyed would be replaced by 2 better ones. Every damaged American ship would be repaired in weeks by floating dry docks and service squadrons that could operate thousands of miles from home. Japan had none of this. Every aircraft lost was irreplaceable in practical terms. Every experienced pilot killed represented skills that would take years to rebuild, years Japan did not have. Every damaged ship sat in dock for months, because repair facilities were overwhelmed and spare parts were scarce. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding a destroyer during this period, would write in his post-war memoir, "We were not fighting America's Navy, we were fighting America's industry, and the industry was winning." The morning after Hailstone ended, Admiral Masami Kobayashi, commander of Truk's devastated garrison, filed his final report to Combined Fleet Headquarters. His prose was formal, bureaucratic, and carefully controlled, but certain phrases revealed the depth of his understanding about what had just occurred. Enemy forces demonstrated integration of air and surface capabilities beyond our doctrine, he wrote. Defensive measures proved inadequate against sustained, coordinated assault, conducted with technological advantages in radar detection and fire control. Recommendations: fundamental re-evaluation of defensive doctrine may be required. It was the understatement of the war. Fundamental re-evaluation was required, and it would never come. 2 days later, Combined Fleet Headquarters relieved Kobayashi of command. On May 30th, 1944, he was forced into retirement. The Imperial Japanese Navy, unable to admit that its doctrine was obsolete and its assumptions were wrong, blamed the commander who had been forced to operate within those failed assumptions. Kobayashi would live to see his country's surrender. Whether he took any satisfaction from being proven correct is not recorded. For the ships and aircraft of Task Force 58, Operation Hailstone was merely the opening movement of a campaign that would carry them across the Central Pacific. On February 21st, just 3 days after the Truk strikes, American carriers attacked Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Mariana Islands. On March 18th, Iowa participated in the bombardment of Mealy Atoll in the Marshalls. The Fast Carrier Task Force, built around the integration of air power, surface firepower, and mobile logistics, had become the dominant weapon system of the Pacific War. The Japanese Combined Fleet would attempt one more major engagement, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where Japanese naval aviation would be destroyed so completely that American pilots mockingly called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Of 430 Japanese carrier aircraft launched, only 130 would return. American losses, 29 aircraft. The kill ratio was even more lopsided than Truk. After the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier aviation effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carriers, reported to Combined Fleet, "The first mobile fleet has been rendered impotent. The main force still exists, but without adequate aircraft, pilots, or fuel, offensive operations are impossible. The Imperial Navy can choose when to die, but it can no longer choose when to fight." It was an epitaph for Kantai Kessen, for 40 years of Japanese naval doctrine, and for the assumption that quality of spirit could overcome quality of material. USS Iowa, the battleship whose 16-inch guns had helped sink Katori during Operation Hailstone, would serve for another 50 years. She would bombard Japanese home islands in 1945. She would return to service during the Korean War, Vietnam, and even the Gulf War of 1991, firing her last shots in anger 47 years after Truk. When she was finally decommissioned for the last time in October 1990, she had outlived not just the Imperial Japanese Navy she had fought at Truk, but the Soviet Navy she had been reactivated to deter. Today, Iowa sits as a museum ship in Los Angeles, her 16-inch guns silent, her teak decks walked by tourists rather than sailors. But mounted on the bulkhead of her wardroom is a plaque listing her battle honours. Truk Operation Hailstone, February 17–18, 1944 is near the top. It was Iowa's combat debut. It was also the debut of a new kind of naval warfare that made battleships like Yamato irrelevant before they ever fired their massive guns in anger. The strategic lessons of Operation Hailstone rippled far beyond the Pacific War. American and British planners studying Truk's devastation applied those lessons to the D-Day landings in Normandy 4 months later. The scale of preliminary bombardment, the sheer weight of explosive dropped on beach defences before the first soldier went ashore, was directly informed by what had worked at Truk. Thousands of Allied soldiers who survived the Normandy landings owed their lives to lessons learned in the skies over a Japanese atoll they had never heard of. The technological advantages demonstrated at Truk radar fire control, proximity fuses, fighter direction, night operations became standard throughout the U.S. Navy. By war's end, these capabilities had been refined to the point where American carriers could conduct round-the-clock operations in any weather, something no other navy could match. The integration of air power, surface forces, and mobile logistics that destroyed Truk became the template for every amphibious operation that followed. For Japan, Operation Hailstone marked the moment when strategic illusions could no longer be sustained. The decisive battle doctrine that had shaped Japanese naval planning, since Tsushima had promised that quality would overcome quantity, that superior fighting spirit would compensate for material disadvantage, that one perfect engagement would turn the tide of war. Truk demonstrated that all of these assumptions were false. American quality matched or exceeded Japanese quality. The American spirit was no less determined, and American quantity was so overwhelming that no single battle could possibly decide the war's outcome. In the years after the war, historians and military analysts would debate endlessly about whether Japan ever had a chance to win the Pacific War. The answer that emerges from careful study of Operation Hailstone is clear: not after American industrial mobilization reached full capacity. By early 1944, the United States was producing ships, aircraft, and munitions at rates that Japan could not match and could not counter. Every month, the war continued. The material imbalance grew more extreme. Every battle, even Japanese tactical victories, represented attrition Japan could not afford and America could easily replace. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze program, understood this reality with brutal clarity. His post-war interrogation revealed his thought process in late 1944. Conventional warfare against the Americans had become impossible. They had more of everything: more ships, more planes, more pilots, more fuel, more ammunition. Every engagement, win or lose, brought us closer to defeat because we could not replace our losses, and they could. The only way to make them reconsider their advance was to attack their will rather than their capacity, hence the Special Attack Forces. Kamikaze attacks, the deliberate sacrifice of pilots and aircraft in suicide missions, were not expressions of Japanese fanaticism. They were rational responses to technological and material inferiority so extreme that conventional tactics had become futile. When your pilots have 100 hours of training facing pilots with 600 hours, when your aircraft are outmatched in every performance characteristic, when your industrial base can barely replace current losses, let alone expand production, suicide attacks become a mathematically logical choice. One kamikaze hitting a carrier accomplished more than 10 conventional attacks that would be shot down before reaching their targets. The logic was sound. The problem was that even kamikaze attacks could not overcome the fundamental reality demonstrated at Truk. American industrial power could absorb losses, adapt tactics, and continue advancing with a momentum that no amount of Japanese sacrifice could halt. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and who survived the war to become one of Japan's most insightful naval historians, wrote the most penetrating analysis of Operation Hailstone and what it represented. His essay, published in 1953, pulled no punches. We attacked Pearl Harbor with 350 aircraft, confident that this represented the cutting edge of naval power. The Americans lost more aircraft than that in 2 days at Truk without pausing their operations. We built our entire strategy around the quality of our ships, the skill of our crews, and the superiority of our spirit. The Americans built their strategy around the products of their factories. When we sank one of their carriers, 3 more appeared. When we shot down one of their pilots, 4 more took his place. We were artisans competing against an assembly line. We never had a chance once their industrial mobilization reached full capacity. Fuchida's insight cuts to the heart of what Operation Hailstone demonstrated. The decisive battle doctrine assumed that naval warfare was fundamentally about combat between warships, that superior ships, crews, and tactics would determine victory. Operation Hailstone proved that modern naval warfare was about systems. The integration of air power, surface forces, radar technology, communications, logistics, and industrial production into a coordinated whole that could project overwhelming power across thousands of miles of ocean. Japan had built a navy designed to win battles. America had built a navy designed to win a war. The difference was everything. When Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet during Operation Hailstone, wrote his after-action report, he included an observation that revealed how thoroughly American naval doctrine had evolved. The Fast Carrier Task Force has proven itself capable of sustained operations against any enemy target within aircraft range. The integration of airstrikes with surface forces provides flexibility impossible to achieve with either arm operating independently. Enemy forces concentrated at defended positions can be neutralized without the necessity of direct assault. Recommendation: continue developing doctrine that emphasizes mobility, flexibility, and the integration of all available capabilities rather than reliance on any single weapon system. It was the opposite of Kantai Kessen in every way. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized decisive engagement, American doctrine emphasized sustained pressure. Where Japanese strategy concentrated forces for the single perfect battle, American strategy dispersed forces to strike multiple targets simultaneously. Where Japanese planning assumed their quality would overcome American quantity, American planning assumed that quantity was itself a quality, that overwhelming numbers of good enough ships and aircraft could defeat smaller numbers of theoretically superior ones. And at Truk, these contrasting doctrines had met in battle. The result was so one-sided it barely qualified as combat. It was exterminated. In the decades after the war, as military historians studied the Pacific Campaign, Operation Hailstone emerged as one of the clearest examples of how technological and industrial advantages translate into operational success. The battle, if it can even be called a battle, demonstrated that radar-directed fire control made surface engagements possible at ranges previously unimaginable, giving ships like Iowa overwhelming advantage against opponents still relying on optical rangefinders. Carrier-based air power could project force hundreds of miles beyond the range of any battleship gun, making carriers rather than battleships the capital ships of modern navies. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells dramatically increased defensive capability, making massed air attacks far more costly for attackers lacking similar technology. Fighter direction using radar allowed coordination of air operations on scales impossible with visual signals, permitting attacks by hundreds of aircraft acting in coordinated waves. Industrial capacity determined staying power more than tactical victories, making attrition a viable strategy for nations with overwhelming production advantages. Mobile logistics, the ability to refuel, rearm, and repair at sea, extended operational range indefinitely, allowing sustained operations far from established bases. Every one of these advantages was demonstrated at Truk, and every one represented capability Japan could not match. The human cost of this technological disparity was devastating. At Truk, approximately 4,500 Japanese military personnel died. Most were killed not in combat, but in attacks they could not effectively resist. They died at their posts, on burning ships, in collapsing buildings, often without ever seeing the aircraft that killed them. They died because their leaders had sent them to defend a position with inadequate tools against an enemy who brought overwhelming technological superiority. Captain Tamekio Oda, who died on Katori's bridge, received his posthumous promotion to Rear Admiral. The recognition was deserved. He had fought courageously against impossible odds, but courage was not enough. It had never been enough, and the tragedy of Truk was that thousands of men died bravely, died honourably, died in defence of positions their doctrine said were impregnable, when the truth was that their deaths accomplished nothing beyond demonstrating the bankruptcy of that doctrine. The aftermath of Operation Hailstone saw American forces continuing their advance with barely a pause. On February 20th, Marines landed on Eniwetok. By February 23rd, the atoll was secured. The Marshall Islands campaign was complete. Next came the Marianas Saipan, Tinian, Guam, taken between June and August. Then the Philippines, then Iwo Jima, then Okinawa. And at each step, the pattern established at Truk repeated. Preliminary airstrikes from carriers neutralized enemy air power. Battleships and cruisers bombarded shore defenses. Amphibious forces landed under continuous air cover, and mobile logistics kept the entire force supplied and operational thousands of miles from Pearl Harbor. By the time Japan surrendered in September 1945, the U.S. Navy had grown to include 99 aircraft carriers of all types. Japan had built 25 carriers during the entire war and had exactly 0 operational by war's end. American battleships had bombarded the Japanese home islands with impunity because Japanese forces no longer had the aircraft or fuel to resist, and the surrender ceremony itself was held aboard USS Missouri, Iowa's sister ship, in Tokyo Bay, the ultimate symbol of American naval power, anchored in sight of the Imperial Palace. The 16-inch guns that Iowa had fired at Katori during Operation Hailstone were the same guns that Missouri would fire at targets on Honshu in 1945. They were the same guns that Iowa herself would fire in Korea, in Vietnam, and in the Gulf War. They were powerful weapons, but they had never been the decisive weapons. The decisive weapon was American industrial capacity, organized and deployed through a naval doctrine that emphasized integration, flexibility, and sustained operations rather than the single decisive engagement. When historians look back at the Pacific War, they often focus on iconic moments: Pearl Harbor, Midway, Leyte Gulf, the surrender aboard Missouri. But Operation Hailstone deserves equal attention because it marked the moment when Japanese naval strategy's fundamental assumptions were proven false. Not in a single climactic engagement between battleships, but in 2 days of methodical destruction that left Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific a burning ruin without a single American amphibious landing. The lesson of Truk was clear. Modern naval warfare was not about heroic encounters between individual ships. It was about the integration of technology, logistics, and industrial production into systems that could project power across oceans. It was about radar that could see in darkness, aircraft that could strike from hundreds of miles away, fire control systems that could engage targets beyond visual range, and factories that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Japan had built a navy to win battles. America had built a navy to win a war. At Truk, those two philosophies met. The outcome was never in doubt. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.